What if I told you that a tiny country smaller than West Virginia once controlled more of the world's oceans than the British Empire at its peak? What if I told you this nation built the first global corporation, invented the stock market as we know it, and at one point was so wealthy that tulip bulbs sold for more than houses? This is the story of the Dutch Empire, and it's nothing like what you think you know about European colonialism. Picture this: it's 1602, and while England is still figuring out how to be relevant on the world stage, the Dutch have just created something that will change capitalism forever. The Dutch East India Company wasn't just a trading company, it was the world's first multinational corporation, complete with its own army, navy, and the power to declare war. But here's the twist that nobody talks about. The Dutch didn't stumble into global dominance by accident. They engineered it through pure innovation, ruthless efficiency, and a business model so advanced that modern corporations still study it today. The story begins in the most unlikely place imaginable. The Netherlands in the late 1500s was basically a collection of swampy provinces fighting for independence from the most powerful empire in the world, Spain. Philip II of Spain controlled vast territories from the Americas to the Philippines, while the Dutch were literally building their country on land they had to steal from the sea. But sometimes being the underdog forces you to become smarter than everyone else. Here's where the Dutch made their first genius move. Instead of trying to compete with Spain's massive territorial empire, they decided to dominate something far more valuable: trade routes. While other European powers were focused on conquering land and extracting gold, the Dutch realized that controlling the flow of goods was infinitely more profitable than simply owning the places where those goods came from. The Dutch had several natural advantages that they exploited brilliantly. First, their geography. The Netherlands sat at the mouth of major European rivers, making it a natural hub for continental trade. Second, their political system. While most of Europe was stuck under absolute monarchies, the Dutch developed a more merchant-friendly republic where business interests had real political power. Third, and most importantly, they were forced to become master shipbuilders and navigators simply to survive in their watery homeland. But the real breakthrough came when the Dutch figured out how to weaponize capitalism itself. In 1602, they merged several competing trading companies into the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, better known as the VOC, or Dutch East India Company. This wasn't just a bigger trading company, it was a completely new kind of organization. The VOC had the authority to negotiate treaties, establish colonies, build fortifications, maintain armies, and wage war, all in the name of profit. Think about how revolutionary this was. The VOC was essentially a private company with the powers of a nation-state, funded by public investment through the world's first stock exchange in Amsterdam. Investors could buy shares in Dutch maritime expeditions, spreading both the risk and the potential rewards across thousands of people. This system allowed the Dutch to raise enormous amounts of capital for their overseas ventures, while distributing the financial risk in ways that had never been possible before. The Dutch East India Company's first target was the spice trade, and for good reason. In the early 1600s, spices like nutmeg, cloves, and pepper were literally worth more than gold. The markup on these commodities was astronomical. Nutmeg bought in the Indonesian Spice Islands could be sold in Amsterdam for a profit of over 3,000%. The Dutch quickly realized that whoever controlled the source of these spices would control unimaginable wealth. But here's where the Dutch strategy gets really interesting. Instead of trying to conquer vast territories like the Spanish and Portuguese, they focused on establishing strategic trading posts and controlling key maritime choke points. They built a network of fortified trading bases stretching from the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa to Nagasaki in Japan, with the crown jewel being Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, which served as the administrative heart of their Asian empire. The Dutch approach to empire was fundamentally different from their competitors. The Spanish conquered the Americas and extracted silver. The Portuguese established coastal trading posts but generally worked within existing local power structures. The Dutch, however, created an integrated commercial network that was designed to maximize profit through efficient trade monopolies. They didn't just want to extract wealth, they wanted to control the entire economic ecosystem. This is where the story takes a darker turn, because the Dutch efficiency that made them incredibly wealthy also made them incredibly ruthless. In the Banda Islands, the original source of nutmeg, the Dutch systematically eliminated the local population when they refused to grant the VOC a monopoly on nutmeg production. They depopulated entire islands and replaced the indigenous inhabitants with enslaved workers to maintain their spice monopolies. The Dutch also became major players in the Atlantic slave trade, establishing colonies in Brazil, the Caribbean, and North America. New Amsterdam, which would later become New York City, served as a key hub in their North American operations. The Dutch West India Company, founded in 1621 as the Atlantic counterpart to the VOC, established a brutal but profitable system of plantation agriculture based on enslaved African labor. What made the Dutch Empire particularly effective was their willingness to adapt local practices while maintaining central control. In Indonesia, they often worked through existing local rulers, creating puppet governments governments that maintained the appearance of local authority while serving Dutch commercial interests. In Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, they took over Portuguese trading posts and expanded them into a comprehensive system for controlling cinnamon production. The financial innovation that powered Dutch expansion was equally revolutionary. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, established in 1602, became the first place where investors could trade shares in joint stock companies on a regular basis. This created a sophisticated financial ecosystem that could fund long-term commercial ventures on a scale that had never been possible before. The Dutch also pioneered modern banking practices, insurance systems, and credit instruments that made international trade far more efficient and less risky. By the mid-1600s, the Dutch had achieved something remarkable. Despite having a population of only about 2 million people, they controlled more international trade than any other nation on Earth. Dutch ships carried goods between countries that had no direct contact with the Netherlands. They dominated the lucrative trade routes between Asia and Europe, controlled much of the inter-Asian maritime trade, and had established profitable colonies on 4 continents. The peak of Dutch power came during what historians call the Golden Age, roughly from 1600 to 1700. During this period, the Netherlands was not just wealthy but culturally dominant. Amsterdam became the financial capital of Europe. Dutch art, particularly painting, reached unprecedented heights with masters like Rembrandt and Vermeer. Dutch science and philosophy, led by figures like Anton van Leeuwenhoek and Baruch Spinoza, pushed the boundaries of human knowledge. But the most famous symbol of Dutch Golden Age excess wasn't art or architecture, it was flowers. The tulip mania of the 1630s saw speculative trading in tulip bulbs reach absolutely insane levels. At the peak of the bubble, rare tulip bulbs were selling for more than the price of houses. A single bulb of the Semper Augustus variety allegedly sold for enough money to buy a canal-side mansion in Amsterdam. When the bubble burst, it wiped out fortunes overnight and became one of history's first recorded speculative bubbles. However, the Dutch Empire's greatest strength was also the source of its eventual decline. The highly efficient, profit-driven approach that made them so successful in the 1600s began to work against them as the world changed. Other European powers, particularly Britain and France, learned from Dutch innovations while developing their own imperial strategies that combined commercial efficiency with greater territorial control. The turning point came during a series of wars with England in the second half of the 1600s. The Dutch had initially allied with England against their common enemy, Spain, but as both nations expanded their maritime empires, conflict became inevitable. The Anglo-Dutch Wars of 1652 to 1674 were primarily fought over trade routes and colonial territories. While the Dutch held their own militarily, these wars were enormously expensive and strained their financial resources. The real problem was demographic. The Netherlands simply didn't have enough people to maintain a global empire indefinitely. While they could afford to hire soldiers and sailors from other countries, this made their military less reliable and more expensive than the national armies that Britain and France could field. As these larger nations developed their own sophisticated financial systems and trading companies, the Dutch advantage in capital and commercial expertise began to erode. The Dutch also faced challenges from changing technology and trade patterns. The development of new sailing techniques and ship designs made long-distance trade more accessible to other nations. The discovery of alternative sources for key commodities broke some of their most profitable monopolies. Coffee cultivation spread from Yemen to Java to the Caribbean, reducing Dutch control over this lucrative trade. Sugar production expanded throughout the Atlantic world, making their Brazilian and Caribbean plantations less strategically important. By the early 1700s, the Dutch Empire was increasingly squeezed between the growing power of Britain and France. The War of Spanish Succession, fought from 1701 to 1714, saw the Netherlands fighting as a junior partner in a coalition led by Britain. While they were on the winning side, the enormous cost of the war further weakened their position relative to their larger allies. The decline accelerated during the 1700s as Britain systematically displaced Dutch influence in key regions. The British East India Company gradually took control of Indian trade networks that had been dominated by the Dutch. British naval power made it increasingly difficult for Dutch merchants to compete in Atlantic trade routes. Even in areas where the Dutch maintained formal control, like Indonesia, they found themselves increasingly dependent on local allies and unable to enforce their authority as effectively as they had in earlier decades. The final blow came during the Napoleonic period, when the Netherlands was occupied by France and later incorporated into the French Empire. This disrupted Dutch trade networks and forced the British to take control of strategic Dutch colonies to prevent them from falling into French hands. The Cape Colony, Ceylon, and parts of the Dutch East Indies were occupied by British forces and never fully returned to Dutch control. When the Netherlands regained its independence in 1815, the world had fundamentally changed. The Industrial Revolution was beginning to transform global economics in ways that favored nations with large domestic markets and abundant natural resources. The Dutch still controlled valuable territories, particularly in Indonesia, but they were no longer the commercial hegemon they had been 2 centuries earlier. The final chapter of the Dutch Empire played out over the next 150 years as a slow retreat from global power. The Dutch maintained control over Indonesia until after World War II, but this was increasingly a defensive holding action rather than dynamic expansion. Dutch colonial policy became more focused on direct extraction of wealth from their remaining territories rather than the innovative commercial networks that had originally built their empire. The end came rapidly after 1945. The Indonesian War of Independence from 1945 to 1949 ended Dutch control over their most valuable remaining territory. Suriname gained independence in 1975. Today, the Dutch maintain sovereignty only over a few Caribbean islands that choose to remain associated with the Netherlands. What makes the Dutch Empire fascinating isn't just its rise and fall, but what it reveals about the nature of power in the early modern world. The Dutch proved that a small nation could dominate global trade through superior financial organization, technological innovation, and strategic thinking. They created institutional frameworks for international capitalism that are still in use today. The joint stock company, the stock exchange, modern banking, and maritime insurance all have their roots in Dutch innovations from the 1600s. But the Dutch experience also demonstrates the limits of purely commercial empire. Without a large population base and extensive territorial control, even the most efficient and profitable commercial network eventually becomes vulnerable to competition from larger, more resource-rich rivals. The Dutch Empire succeeded brilliantly for about a century, but it couldn't sustain that success indefinitely against the demographic and geographic advantages of nations like Britain and France. The legacy of the Dutch Empire continues to shape our world today. Modern international business practices trace their origins to Dutch innovations. The global financial system still operates on principles first developed in Amsterdam, and the complex relationship between capitalism and colonialism that characterized Dutch expansion remains relevant to understanding how economic globalization works in our own time. Perhaps most importantly, the Dutch Empire reminds us that history is not inevitable. A small, swampy collection of provinces became a global superpower through intelligence, innovation, and adaptation. They lost that position not because they made terrible mistakes, but because the world changed in ways that made their particular advantages less decisive. The rise and fall of the Dutch Empire is ultimately a story about how quickly the balance of global power can shift when technology, economics, and demographics align in new ways. From humble windmills to the world's first corporations, the Dutch changed the tides of history, and their echoes still shape the world we live in today.